Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you the most topical energy matters in an informal setting. My name is Richard Sverrisson and today I'm joined in Madrid by my colleague Andrés Cala, who's editor for Spain, and by Pedro Linares, who's a professor of energy policy at the Comillas University here in Madrid. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
We are going to be discussing mostly regulation and policy. I wonder, Pedro, if you could give us a bit of the background here in Spain. You recently had an election. There wasn't really a clear outcome. What's going on now? Where does it leave energy policy in this country?
Well, I think we have been riding like a roller coaster in terms of energy policy in the last, I would say, 4 years. We had right-wing governments that had a particular energy policy which was basically focused on keeping energy costs low, as low as possible. That resulted, for example, in a moratorium for renewable energy feed-in tariffs and basically on a revival of some of the traditional power plants. Then we changed government last year and the focus shifted completely. So now we are absolutely focused on decarbonisation. So the government came in just in time to prepare the National Energy Plan, which has set very ambitious objectives in terms of decarbonisation, and that is accompanied basically by a strong increase in renewable energy building. But the problem is that there are no yet policies that kind of materialize all these change in direction. And the second problem is that we're having elections next Sunday.
Okay.
So we don't know what is going to happen. But probably it seems that we would possibly have a similar type of government like the one we have now, but in a minority. So we're not sure about their capability of getting strong policies passed by parliament. I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now. We have a very strong sense of direction, already backed also by the European Commission. But we don't know yet what will be the actual policies that will be implemented.
Okay, but you have the targets and the objectives as such, but not the roadmap or how to get there.
Right, not the instruments, I would say. We have long-term targets, which to some extent, I would say, are widely shared by industry and by society. So people in general are happy with progressing towards decarbonisation. So in general sense, I would say that the targets are widely shared. But as usual, the devil is in the details, and we don't have yet the instruments. And I guess there will be much more discussion about the instruments.
Just for those who are not so familiar with Spanish policy, what are those targets exactly for renewables?
So basically the National Energy Plan says that we should reduce our emissions 20% compared to 1990 levels.
By 2030?
By 2030. Given the trajectory of Spanish emissions, that is equivalent to a 45% reduction compared to 2005 levels, which were our peak. So it's a very drastic reduction. I think we're heading towards 42% renewables, although there's a trick there because of accounting rules. So the actual share of renewable energy electricity is a bit lower, but not around 40%.
Is that...
that is higher than the European objectives. For example, the European target is 32%.
So is it electricity produced or part of the energy consumed?
Yeah, it is final energy. It is the share of final energy. And the European target is 32%. And we are going for around 40%, which is basically equivalent to around 80% of the power of the electricity produced with renewables.
80%?
Right, including hydro. We do have a significant amount of hydro.
But by 2030, I mean...
By 2030.
And is there, in terms of, the political consensus, is this sort of... You say there's a lot of agreement on this. So is this kind of shared between the parties of the right and the left, really?
I think there's a significant amount of agreement. I mean, the last government, for example, the right-wing government, was happy with a report that was issued by a panel of experts that said that we could go for 72%. So I would say between 70 and 80%, maybe there's a bit of discussion. And it all depends, of course, on the cost, on the evolution of the cost of renewables. But I would say everybody across the political spectrum is happy to go beyond 70%. Maybe not up to 80%. So maybe there's some discussion there, but no less than 70%. So I think that's a quite wide consensus.
And earlier you were saying that, of course, the devil is in the details. And specifically, you mentioned transport and industry. And these are key issues, not just in Spain, of course, but in the EU. There are the possibility of border taxes, of other types of fiscal measures. But at the end, those details mean that even if there is agreement on the bullet points, so to speak, it's not altogether certain that they will actually be aggressive enough to pass the legislation, the real practical legislation, to reach those targets. And one of the interesting parts there that you mentioned is, of course, the money. I mean, how do we attract the private investment to do all this if this is not going to land on the states, on the different governments? How likely is it that even if we agree on the bottom line, that we actually get there?
I mean, we've been talking about the electricity sector, right? And the electricity sector, I was saying that just some minutes ago, I think it's probably the easiest one. And I'm probably oversimplifying, but I mean, the electricity sector is about investing in renewables. And all political parties think that provides a certain opportunity. And given that the cost of renewables is going down and down, it's probably not expected to be a large cost for the system. So that's where I see a lot of agreements in increasing significantly the amount of renewables in the system. Now, if you go beyond the electricity sector, this is where the real problem starts. So, as you correctly pointed out, if you want to progress, if you want to achieve this 20% reduction of emissions, you need to do drastic reductions in transport, in buildings, and in industry. Probably industry not until a bit later, because it's probably more expensive. So, for example, if you look until 2030, the big challenge is buildings and transport. And this is where I think there's not that much agreement. I mean, people share that we should decarbonize, but I think people are not aware of how costly that might be if we address buildings. Rehabilitation, refurbishing buildings, and energy refurbishing is quite expensive. Although, of course, it has many side benefits, but it is quite expensive. In terms of transport, until electric vehicles become competitive, which this may happen, I don't know, 2022, 2025, who knows? Until they become competitive, if you want to push further for them, that is going to be, again, very costly. And also, more importantly, probably, the only way to reduce transport emissions significantly is to reduce mobility, is to reduce demand. And that means changing behaviors. And that means telling people, maybe you cannot access Madrid, as happens in London or in Oslo, or maybe you have to pay a very big penalty if you want to enter the cities, or maybe you are going to be having to pay a lot more for your car, like happens in the Nordic countries, right? And those are the measures where I think are going to prove very unpopular, and where not even the left-wing parties may be willing to get into that.
Because it's tricky electorally, isn't it? It's probably quite a big vote loser.
Right, and if you follow the electoral campaigns, the one that we're having right now, or the one we had in April, everybody was talking about climate change is a big concern. Nobody talked about taxes, about carbon taxes. Nobody pronounced that word, of course.
Or how to pay for decarbonisation.
Right, and the problem is that I think when you're dealing with transport and buildings, we're actually talking about money that has to be paid by households in order to do that.
Is there another way to, like some countries, I mean, you've got a huge explosion of, for example, electric vehicles in Norway. And the way of incentivizing that is to
subsidize
them heavily, but also allow them to enter the cities free of charge
which is also a kind of subsidy.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
But is that an option for Spain, for example? Because if you have solar panel on your roof, you have a battery and an EV, I mean, surely that's the perfect idea of a decarbonised world.
Well, I don't know, because the electric vehicle, I think it's the future, and nobody doubts that. Of course, it depends on how it's going to be the evolution of the cost of the batteries, and I'm sure it's going to be competitive very shortly. But until that happens, that is going to be costly. Solar panels on the roofs, of course, they are getting cheaper and cheaper. And we have grid parity, but grid parity is not competitiveness. The real competitiveness is generation parity. And that has not been achieved yet, although we're very close. And also the point is whether, for example, it makes sense to build solar panels in all roofs, or it makes sense to build them in the middle of Castile with a lot of open spaces and profit from economies of scale. So what I mean is that I think there are many possibilities, many itineraries for achieving this. And there are two big questions here. Is the bigger one is how much are we willing to pay for this? And last week, El Cano Institute, they published a big survey on opinion polls in Spain. And it seems that a majority of Spanish people are willing to pay something, although not a huge amount of it, at least something for that. So I think that the sweet spot is going to be how do we find the right measures that actually make us advance in this trend towards decarbonization that is acceptable at a societal level in terms of cost? Or how are we be able to somehow finance that cost or provide the right warranties so that investors will come in and do the investments, which in the case of renewables, I think is fine. In the case of buildings, maybe the trick lies in finance, cheap finance as a way to give this incentive, which is again a better way instead of just giving subsidies away. I think there are some instruments that might be acceptable. I think there are some other instruments that are going to be very costly.
Yeah, sitting in Northern Europe and looking at all the massive expansion of solar power in Germany, even in the Netherlands now that they've opened a big floating solar park. You look at Spain and think, why isn't there more here? You've got the sun, you've got the wind as well.
Right.
And why
and wind has been really strong, I think.
But on the solar front, because you think, the so-called prosumers who could both produce and consume their own power. I mean, that couldn't that revolutionize, in a sense, the country's energy system?
I think it might. But I think we should compare centralized versus decentralized and see whether the economies of scale compensate the potential reduction in losses, which is basically the discussion here. You also have this philosophical empowering effect, which is also valuable, and I think it has to be considered also. The problem right now is that the current regulation we have, for example, for setting solar panels in households is flawed. Basically, the tariff is not well designed, so we're cross-subsidizing through the fixed part of the tariff. We're cross-subsidizing these installations. So the problem is, right now, with the current context, I cannot say whether it makes sense to go for one option or the other. I think we should first set the right setting, the fair distribution of costs, and then allow all of them to happen. And if somebody wants to build this solar panel in their home, that's great, and maybe they're making money for everybody. The problem is, how do you align the incentives with the social benefits, right? And I think there is a lot of potential. But that said, we have one problem here in Spain, and again, this is an interesting discussion if you're considering, for example, decentralized solar energy, which is that in Spain, whenever you talk about giving locational signals in electricity markets, they tell you you're crazy. They tell you that goes against the unity of the markets. So the tariff has to be the same one all across Spain. And that's a problem, because it makes sense, for example, to build solar panels in Madrid, where the network is heavily loaded, right? And it wouldn't make sense to build them in the middle of the countryside, right? But we are not able to get householders in Madrid get those benefits because the tariff is the same for everybody, right? So I'm not sure whether we will be able to actually see that happening in the absence of the right signals.
Again, what you were saying it's in the details. That's where the details need to be sorted out.
Right.
And of course, any of these measures, even if they make all of the common sense that they do, even if there's agreement, it requires, some political courage. The most likely scenario, as we've talked about, is that Spain will have a government. We don't know what color it'll be, but it'll be a weak government. It will not be a government in the majority. Is this even possible? Any of these?
My concern is not with the governments. My concern is rather with the opposition. If the opposition thinks that there are high chances that we will have an election again soon, then of course they have the incentive to behave more electorally and less responsibly, as to say, less long-term and more short-term. So I think the government, and I think the current minister, she has a lot of courage. So I think she has what we need to do this. But we also need the responsibility from the part of the opposition parties to say, okay, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, let's vote for what makes sense, let's not vote for what doesn't make sense. Not with an electoral approach, but with a responsibility long-term approach. So I think I'm more concerned about the attitude of the opposition in this setting. Is this going to be taken as an opportunity to break down the governments? Or is it going to be taken as an opportunity to get into consensus and try to progress? And I think that's a big question.
Because it could end up being political point scoring, as you say, rather than, very short-term basis.
Right. These days, for example, I remember a couple of days reading Martin Wolf's in the Financial Times saying, I would like to have a hung parliament, because that ensures that the policies that come out are going to be consensual, right? You might think the same in the Spanish setting. You could say a hung parliament may be more interesting in order to produce more consensus-based policies that would be more stable, right? But that depends on the attitude of the political parties to engage into this long-term view rather than into short-term joking around and trying to bring down the governments.
I mean, if we come back to the element of private investment, and one of the ways in which, or some of the large investments into Spain that we see is in the PPA market. Right. So Spain has seen quite a boom in these. Do you expect that to continue? This is for wind and solar.
I mean, there's a lot of movement right now. In fact, I'm a bit concerned about repeating a bubble. Because there is a scarcity signal from the point of view of access to the network. And also, so on the one hand, we had big expectations drawn by the government about these new auctions. So the conditions will be there for private investment. I'm sure about it. There will be plenty of demand for new investments, certain stability. But I'm a bit concerned about the scarcity signals driven by the network and also by town councils and all that. And I'm a bit concerned that all these expectations might drive a bubble up and we might end up with higher prices than we expect. I don't know.
And the bubble could burst then.
Yeah. Of course, that's the problem.
That's bubbles. They burst, absolutely. But there are some ambitious programs in place at the moment. What are the auctions for wind in Spain? Is it 6 gigawatts a year?
So the national plan says that if we are to achieve these targets, we would need 6,000 gigawatts renewables per year.
Okay. To achieve the targets,
To achieve the targets. The drafts of our law on climate change, which has not yet been approved, says that there will be a minimum of 3,000 gigawatts auctions. Something between 3 and 6 is probably... because some people expect that probably you don't need to auction the full 6 gigawatts. Maybe a part of it will go through auctions, but maybe another part will go merchant. We don't know. But yeah, I mean, there's 3 gigawatts minimum during 10 years. That's a lot of investments. That's a lot of private money that can come in.
3 gigawatts a year. That's huge.
The maximum capacity we have installed in Spain is 4.
Yeah, exactly. So
and in fact, I remember we have been having these discussions here in Spain, and for example, if you look at there are some numbers out there by Bloomberg who say that the pipeline is able to provide this 6 gigawatts, but only after some use. The pipeline has been dead, so they expect that at the beginning that could be, and the pipeline seems to be bigger right now for wind than for solar. Of course, you never know. But the point is that some people question whether we might be able to go for 3 gigawatts solar for 2020 and 2021. Probably after 2025 we'll be easy to do that.
Spain was, a few years ago made some controversial changes to some of its laws, sort of retroactive changes to the subsidy schemes. Is there any danger that could happen again?
I don't think so. Basically, because in the past, these retroactive changes were due to the realization that the money that was being paid, which was a feed-in tariff, was probably excessive because the feed-in tariff had not been adjusted to the changes in technology. Now, if you do that through an auction, there is less risk, right? Because there is the competitive pressure. So probably the price resulting from the auction will be better adjusted. And therefore there will be less grounds for retroactive corrections. So yeah, I'm less concerned about that. I'm still a bit concerned about this bubble and this scarcity that might drive prices higher than they should. But I'm less concerned if the mechanism is an auction that there will be this sunk cost that has to be paid. Yeah.
Pedro and Andrés, thank you both very much for joining the Montel Weekly Podcast. We're back next week in London, and then we'll be talking mainly carbon matters. Once again, thank you, and please, listeners, keep up to date with all our stories on Montel News. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you. Goodbye from Madrid.